Imagine walking across one of the really bustling main bridges right in the center of Baghdad.
And this is, roughly the mid-9th century.
Right. So you're in the glittering capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. It's the center of the world's wealth, science, trade, all of it.
Just a massive, thriving metropolis.
Exactly. But right there on the bridge, literally interrupting the flow of merchants and scholars, there's this heavily fortified watchtower.
Yeah.
And mounted right next to that watchtower, guarded by armed state soldiers around the clock, is a severed human head.
It's just a brutally jarring image.
And it hangs there not for a day, not for a week, but for 6 entire years.
6 years. Yeah.
And even with the state military pointing spears at anyone who gets too close, ordinary citizens are actually sneaking out in the dead of night. They're slipping past the patrols just to stand near this severed head and softly recite scripture to it.
They're treating him like a holy martyr.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this because we are diving into a historical event known as the Mihna.
Right, which translates to the Inquisition or the ordeal.
And on paper, if you look at the history books, they often frame this as an obscure, incredibly dense theological debate over something called the creation of the Quran.
Which sounds very academic, very dry.
Right. But the source material we are examining today tears that official narrative to shreds. Because this wasn't a debate among academics in a library.
Not at all.
This was a ruthless, highly calculated political purge.
It really is the ultimate story of statecraft operating under, the camouflage of piety.
Yeah.
Because when we look at historical states that enforce religious ideologies, we have this modern tendency to just, to take them at their word.
We assume they're just zealots.
Exactly. We assume the rulers were simply zealous, maybe misguided believers acting out of deep spiritual conviction.
Right, like they're just trying to save souls.
But what this historical analysis meticulously lays out is that theology, especially in the hands of an absolute monarch, is very often just a weapon.
A tool for control.
Yeah. It's a tool designed to consolidate power, enforce absolute submission, and, crucially, eliminate rivals without making them look like political victims.
Which brings us back to that severed head on the bridge, because that belonged to a man named Ahmad ibn Nasr al-Khuza'i.
Right.
And he wasn't executed by a foreign enemy. He was decapitated personally by his own emperor, the Caliph.
And the official reason for this grotesque, multi-year public display wasn't treason. It wasn't murder or theft.
No. The state executed him and displayed his head because he disagreed with the emperor about the metaphysical nature of how a burning bush worked.
Which is just wild to think about.
It's incredibly dark. So before we get into the secret police and the shadow networks and the violent rebellions, which we have to establish the battleground.
We have to understand the theology that was actually being weaponized here.
Right. Because this entire empire-wide purge hinged on one deeply philosophical question.
Is the Quran the literal, uncreated word of God, or is it a creation of God?
And to grasp why this was such a potent wedge issue, we have to look at the two primary camps, right?
Yeah. So on one side, you had the traditional mainstream Sunni belief.
Okay.
And this doctrine held that the Quran is the literal, uncreated speech of God. It's an eternal attribute of the divine.
So it wasn't, like, made at a specific point in time.
Exactly. It has simply always existed alongside God in its essence, much like God's knowledge or God's power.
So in that view, to suggest the Quran was created would be like suggesting God's wisdom or God's sight was created at some point?
Right, which implies God was somehow incomplete before that moment.
I see. So it's about preserving the eternal perfection of God.
Precisely. But on the other side, you had theological sects like the Mu'tazilites and the Jahmites.
Okay, and what was their angle?
Well, they looked at the exact same premise and saw a massive problem regarding the absolute oneness of God.
The concept of Tawhid, right?
Yes, Tawhid. They argue that God is entirely singular, he's separate from everything else. So if you claim that God's speech is uncreated and eternal, you were essentially arguing that there is a second eternal entity existing right alongside God.
Oh. Which to them sounds uncomfortably close to polytheism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To the Mu'tazilites, anything that is not God himself must be a creation of God.
Right.
Therefore, they argued that God created the speech, the Quran, in time, just like he created the mountains or the angels or the stars.
Okay, I follow the philosophical divide, but the source material brings this down to a very specific, almost bizarre thought experiment used by these scholars.
Oh, the burning bush.
Yes, the story of Moses at the burning bush.
That was the ultimate proving ground for this debate.
Yeah.
Because both sides believed in the literal truth of the Quranic and biblical account. Right.
Where God speaks to Moses from the fire in the tree.
Right. So the Mu'tazilite argument, the one saying the Quran is a created thing, they pointed to that physical tree.
Okay.
They argued that God, being transcendent and beyond space, didn't literally manifest physical vocal cords.
That makes sense.
Instead, God created the phenomenon of speech within the matter of the tree. The tree acted as a physical proxy, outputting the created sound.
Okay, I'm trying to map this to a modern concept. It's almost like they were arguing God as a programmer.
Okay, I like that.
And he wrote a line of code to make the tree's hardware emit a specific audio file.
Yeah.
So the hardware is created, and the audio file, the speech, is also a created output.
That is a very accurate way to visualize their logic. It's a created output. But the traditional Sunni scholars presented a counter-argument that created this devastating philosophical paradox.
What did they say?
They looked at the Mu'tazilites and said, okay, let's follow your logic. When the voice came from the bush, the exact words spoken were, I am God. There was no deity but me.
Right.
If God merely created that speech inside the tree, and it wasn't the direct uncreated attribute of God himself manifested.
Oh, wait, I see where this is going.
How could a physical created tree say the words, I am God?
Because if it's just a created audio file playing from a tree, then the tree itself is claiming to be the creator.
Exactly.
The tree is committing the ultimate blasphemy.
You nailed it. The Sunni scholars argued that a created thing cannot legitimately claim divinity.
Wow.
Therefore, the speech emanating from the bush could not possibly be a separate created entity. It had to be the direct, uncreated speech of the divine.
It is a fascinating intellectual puzzle.
Yeah.
I really get the philosophical tension.
It's very deep.
But I have to push back here, or at least, play devil's advocate for you, the listener.
Please do.
Because I'm imagining the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun sitting in his palace. He is the absolute ruler of a territory stretching from North Africa to Central Asia.
A massive empire.
He has armies to manage, trade routes to secure, rival empires to fight. Are we really supposed to believe he was so deeply moved by the metaphysical implications of a talking tree that he decided to start torturing his own citizens?
That's the central question.
I mean, these caliphs often believed they were divinely appointed. Wouldn't a heresy genuinely threaten their worldview? Or maybe their eternal soul?
It's a fair point.
Are we sure this was just Machiavellian politics and not genuine religious fanaticism?
Well, the consensus of the historical analysis we are examining is that while Al-Ma'mun may have had, intellectual interests, he was a smart guy, his implementation of this doctrine was definitively not about saving souls.
How do we know that?
The dead giveaway is how he applied the doctrine. He adopted the Mu'tazilite position that the Quran was created precisely because it was a minority opinion, and it was strongly opposed by the mainstream religious establishment.
Yeah.
He didn't adopt a unifying theology. He intentionally adopted a deeply divisive one.
You went looking for a wedge issue.
He needed a wedge issue because he needed a purity test.
Okay, break that down for me.
Think about it. If an absolute ruler wants to test the loyalty of his elite class, asking them to agree with something obvious and popular tells him nothing.
Right, because everyone already agrees with it.
Exactly. But if he forces them to publicly endorse a theology they fundamentally despise under threat of torture, he strips them of their independence.
It's about enforcing active submission.
Yes. When a respected leader publicly capitulates to a doctrine he hates simply because the caliph ordered him to, his moral authority is shattered.
Wow. So the state proves it is the ultimate arbiter of truth.
Precisely.
This reminds me of modern corporate or political purity tests, debates that seem to be about philosophy but are actually just about identifying who will submit to authority.
It's the exact same psychological mechanism.
But why did Al-Ma'mun feel the need to shatter their moral authority in the first place? I mean, if he has the armies and the treasury, why does he care what a group of theologians thinks?
Because that brings us to a dynamic that is absolutely essential to understanding the medieval Islamic world. The caliph had the throne, but he didn't necessarily have the streets.
Yeah.
That was the massive vulnerability of the Abbasid state. Their primary internal rivals weren't necessarily other princes with private armies. The real threat was the religious scholars.
The ulema.
Yes, the ulema.
Yeah.
We have to understand that these scholars were not a formal clergy appointed by the state. They weren't on the government payroll.
Right.
Their authority was entirely grassroots. They lived in the neighborhoods, they traded in the markets, they resolved local disputes, and they taught the masses.
To illustrate the sheer scale of that grassroots power, the source provides this incredible anecdote involving the famous Caliph Harun al-Rashid.
Right, Al-Ma'mun's father, the ruler known from the Arabian Nights legends.
Yeah. So the setting is the city of Raqqa. Harun al-Rashid is residing there with his royal court, including his wife.
And he is the most powerful man on the planet at that moment.
Literally. And suddenly, the city experiences this massive disruption. A highly revered ascetic scholar named Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak happens to arrive in Raqqa.
Just passing through.
Right. And the reaction of the populace is completely overwhelming. The entire city seemingly empties out to greet him.
It's chaotic.
The crowds are so frantic, so desperate to just catch a glimpse of this scholar that they trample the ground and raise a literal blinding cloud of dust that covers the sky over the city.
I mean, picture that. It's an impromptu mob of thousands upon thousands of citizens abandoning whatever they are doing to rush the city gates.
And the caliph's wife is watching this from the safety of the palace.
Right. She looks out at this unbelievable display of genuine, unforced public adoration, and she makes a profoundly dangerous observation.
What does she say?
She says, "This is the real king, not Harun al-Rashid."
This is the real king. Wow. I mean, if you are the head of the Abbasid intelligence network and you hear the caliph's own wife say that, alarms have to be blaring.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you can tax these people, you can draft them into your army, but you do not own their hearts.
No.
This scholar in simple clothes walks into your capital and the people practically tear the walls down for him.
And the source material provides another data point that is even more staggering regarding the funeral of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal later in the century.
Right.
The chronicles report that his funeral in Baghdad was attended by roughly 800,000 men and 60,000 women.
Just logisticalizing that in a medieval city,
Yeah.
nearly 1 million people mobilizing in the streets.
It's mind-boggling. Now, the historical analysis carefully notes that medieval chroniclers were, prone to exaggerating numbers for dramatic effect.
Sure.
But even if we apply extreme skepticism and reduce that number to a fraction of the report, the underlying reality remains undeniable.
They had insane numbers.
These scholars possessed a crowd mobilization power that modern politicians would kill for. During the Inquisition, there was actually a popular saying among the scholars.
Who was it?
They'd say, "Tell the innovators, between us and you is the day of the funerals."
Oh, wow. Meaning the state can enforce whatever doctrine it wants while we're alive, but when we die, you will see who the masses truly recognize as legitimate. The closest modern equivalent I can think of isn't just a popular internet influencer. It's more like a parallel institution.
How do you mean?
Well, imagine a massive, deeply trusted civil rights leader or a populist figure who commands the absolute devotion of millions of people who distrust the federal government.
Right.
If you are a dictator, an unauthorized leader capable of putting hundreds of thousands of bodies in the streets on a day's notice, that's a Tier 1 national security threat because the state realizes that physical power is incredibly brittle if it isn't insulated by moral authority.
Yeah.
The scholars held an absolute monopoly on that moral authority. If a caliph commands an army to march, the soldiers might obey out of fear or for a paycheck.
You're right.
But if a scholar tells the masses that the caliph is an illegitimate tyrant acting against the will of God, the soldiers might just drop their swords.
Which forces us to look backward because the Abbasids weren't just paranoid in a vacuum. Right?
They had historical precedent. They were acutely aware that these scholars weren't always pacifists. They had a violent, very active history of attempting to overthrow governments they deemed corrupt.
The Abbasids were avid students of history, particularly the history of the dynasty they themselves replaced, the Umayyads.
Right.
During the Umayyad era, the religious scholars frequently picked up weapons. The source highlights a massive uprising in the year 81 AH.
And for context, AH stands for Anno Hejre, the Islamic lunar calendar starting from the Prophet's migration to Medina. So 81 AH is roughly the early 700s CE, about 50 years before the Abbasids take over.
Correct. So in 81 AH, a general named Abd al-Rahman ibn al-Ash'ath leads a monumental rebellion against the Umayyad state.
Okay.
But what terrified the ruling class wasn't just the military defection. It was that the rebellion was joined by roughly 500 major religious scholars.
500.
These were the intellectual elite of the Islamic world, men like the highly respected jurist Sa'id ibn Jubair.
So it wasn't a fringe movement. It was the mainstream intelligentsia declaring war on the state.
Exactly. The rebellion ultimately failed. And it was crushed by a notoriously brutal Umayyad governor named al-Hajjaj.
Right.
And he didn't just defeat the rebel army, he systematically executed the scholars, including Sa'id ibn Jubayr.
Wow.
But the executions didn't end the threat. Decades later, you had titanic figures like Abu Hanifa, the founder of one of the 4 major schools of Sunni jurisprudence, openly providing financial and moral backing to the armed rebellion of Zayd ibn Ali.
So the Abbasids inherit an empire where the precedent is already set. If the ulema decide the state is corrupt, they will fund, endorse, and physically join military coups.
Exactly. They knew the scholars were a loaded gun.
But what's fascinating is how the Abbasids themselves navigated this reality to seize power in the first place. Because the source details their rise as an absolute masterclass in underground public relations and shadow networks.
Oh, it was a wildly sophisticated covert operation.
Yeah.
The Abbasid Revolution was initially directed from a tiny, incredibly obscure village in the deserts of modern-day Jordan called Humayam.
How does a shadow network even function in the medieval world? I mean, they don't have encrypted messaging apps.
No, they don't.
They are operating out of a tiny village in the Levant, but their target demographic for the revolution is hundreds of miles away in Khorasan, in modern-day Iran and Afghanistan.
It required years of patience and a highly disciplined courier network disguised as traveling merchants and pilgrims.
Wow.
But the true genius of the operation initiated by figures like Abu Hashim was their messaging strategy.
Right, the PR.
They recognized that the opposition to the Umayyad dynasty was deeply fractured. You had Arab tribes angry about taxation,
Okay.
Persian converts angry about being treated as second-class citizens, deeply Orthodox Muslims angry about the Umayyads' secular lifestyles,
Right.
and even Kuramites and elements of Zoroastrian resistance who were harboring ancient Persian imperial grievances.
Like Zoroastrian resistance.
Yeah.
How do you fold a pre-Islamic Persian religious movement into an Islamic revolution? Those groups have entirely contradictory worldviews.
You do it by employing a slogan of masterful ambiguity.
Okay.
The Abbasid operatives didn't publish a detailed manifesto. Their rallying cry was beautifully vague. The book, the Sunnah, and the chosen one from the family of Muhammad.
Ah, it's the ultimate political blank slate.
Upset.
Everyone who hears that slogan projects their own specific desires onto it. The Orthodox scholars hear the book and the Sunnah and assume it means a return to pious, conservative rule.
Right.
The Persian minorities hear a promise to dismantle the Arab-centric Umayyad aristocracy. And the various Shiite factions hear the family of Muhammad and automatically assume the revolution is fighting to put one of their specific imams on the throne.
Precisely. It was a coalition built entirely on deliberate misunderstanding.
Wow.
But of course, the moment the revolution succeeds and the Abbasids physically take the throne, the ambiguity evaporates.
Right, because now someone actually has to sit on the throne.
Exactly. The coalition members look around and realize, wait, the chosen one is just an Abbasid prince? This isn't what we fought for.
So the Abbasids went from being a popular shadow resistance to being the new target of everyone's grievances.
Almost overnight.
So they needed a new narrative. They couldn't rely on being the fixers anymore. They had to justify why their specific bloodline deserved absolute, unquestioned authority over everyone else.
And their pivot was dramatic. They abandoned the populist rhetoric entirely and introduced a terrifying new political theory of absolute divine right.
Oh, wow.
The second Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, famously declared himself the shadow of God on earth.
That's quite a title.
Yeah. They shifted the concept of the caliphate from a communal leadership role into an absolute hereditary monarchy directly mandated by the heavens.
That is a massive ideological escalation. Because if the caliph is the literal shadow of God, then questioning his tax policy isn't just political dissent.
Right.
It's blasphemy against the divine order.
And to solidify this new reality, they felt compelled to physically erase the Umayyad legacy. They didn't just defeat them, they tried to delete them from history.
Erase them.
The source outlines how the Abbasids systematically hunted down and massacred the living Umayyads, and then, they turned to the dead.
Which is just...
They literally opened the tombs of the former Umayyad caliphs in Damascus, dragged out their remains, and burned them to ash.
Which sets the stage for one of the most tension-filled anecdotes in the entire analysis.
Yes.
The Abbasids have just conquered Syria, slaughtered their rivals, desecrated the graves, and now the commanding general, Abdullah ibn Ali, needs to secure the loyalty of the local population.
Right.
And to do that, he summons the most respected religious scholar in Syria, a man named al-Khuza'i.
This encounter is the perfect distillation of the state's desperate need for moral legitimacy.
Because the general, Abdullah ibn Ali, has the military control of Damascus, but he knows the people view him as a butcher.
Exactly. So he demands an audience with al-Khuza'i to secure a religious stamp of approval. But the general doesn't invite the scholar for a polite conversation over tea.
No.
He constructs a gauntlet of psychological terror.
Walk us through the physical space, because the visual is horrifying.
When al-Khuza'i enters the throne room, he is forced to walk down a long corridor formed by 4 solid rows of the general's elite executioners.
4 rows.
The guards are standing at attention with their weapons drawn, gleaming swords, heavy iron maces, and executioners' axes.
It is a tunnel of guaranteed death.
It really is. Al-Khuza'i has to walk the entire length of this corridor just to reach the general.
And the implication is entirely unsubtle. You are going to give me the theological ruling I want, or you are not walking back out of this room.
The general looks at the scholar and demands a religious justification for the slaughter of the Umayyads. He essentially orders al-Khuza'i to declare that the massacres and the desecration of the graves were righteous acts ordained by God.
But al-Khuza'i refuses to break.
Yeah, he doesn't.
In a room full of drawn axes, he refuses to give the state its soundbite.
He risks his life in a truly breathtaking display of courage. Surrounded by executioners, al-Khuza'i looks the general right in the eye and cites a famous, restrictive hadith, a saying of the Prophet.
Okay, what does he say?
He states that according to sacred law, Muslim blood can only be legally spilled for 3 highly specific reasons: murder, adultery, or apostasy.
And obviously the Umayyads didn't.
Right. The Umayyad royal family, despite their corruption, did not universally fall into those 3 categories regarding a mass execution.
Wow.
So al-Khuza'i effectively tells the man who just conquered Syria to his face, what you did was a forbidden atrocity.
How does the general not signal the executioners right then and there? He has the swords, he has the anger. What stops him?
What stops him is that chilling calculus of crowd power we discussed earlier. The general's enraged, but he isn't suicidal.
Right.
He knows that al-Khuza'i isn't just a man, he is an institution. He is the spiritual imam of the Syrian masses.
Yeah.
If the general's executioners strike down al-Khuza'i in that room, the entire province of Syria will explode into an uncontainable revolt before the blood even dries.
So the scholar's invisible armor was his public influence.
Exactly. The general is forced to let him walk out unharmed.
But the state learns a terrifying lesson that day. They realize that swords cannot cut through moral authority.
Right.
They realize that as long as these scholars maintain their absolute independence, the caliphate is inherently vulnerable. They know a confrontation is inevitable.
Oh, it's just a matter of time.
And that structural instability brings us to the reign of Al-Ma'mun, where the simmering tension finally explodes into apocalyptic chaos.
Yes. So decades pass, and we arrive at the Caliphate of Al-Ma'mun. He does not inherit a stable empire.
No.
His ascension to the throne is the result of a catastrophic civil war against his own brother, the Caliph Al-Ma'mun.
A civil war between siblings that literally tears the Islamic world in half.
Exactly. Now, Al-Ma'mun's power base is situated in the east, in Khorasan. And to win the war, he relies almost entirely on Persian military commanders.
Okay.
The most powerful of these is a man named Fadl ibn Sahl. Fadl was a recent convert to Islam, but culturally and politically he was deeply rooted in the ancient traditions of the pre-Islamic Sasanian Persian Empire.
And the source material highlights a specific visual detail about Fadl that I found incredibly telling.
Oh, the chair.
Yes. When he met with the caliph or conducted official business, he would refuse to ride a horse like a traditional Arab commander. Instead, he rode in a specialized winged chair.
The winged chair was a direct imitation of the ancient Persian emperors.
It's an unbelievable flex. He isn't just commanding an army, he is actively broadcasting a cultural supremacy.
Absolutely.
He is telling the Arab aristocracy in Baghdad, we are the new masters and we are bringing back the old empire.
And that deliberate cultural alienation terrified the traditional establishment in Baghdad.
I bet.
So Al-Ma'mun's Persian-led army eventually besieges Baghdad, brutally bombards the city, and captures and executes his brother Al-Amin.
Brutal.
But then Al-Ma'mun makes a decision that plunges the capital into an abyss. Instead of relocating to Baghdad to assert control, he remains in the east for years,
leaving the capital of the empire in the hands of his deeply unpopular military commanders.
And the military utterly fails to maintain order. The source describes Baghdad descending into a state of violent anarchy for 6 years.
6 years?
Yes, culminating around the year 204 AH.
It becomes a failed state.
Yeah.
The Abbasid military cannot police the streets. In the power vacuum, massive, organized criminal syndicates and gangs, known as the Ayarun, take over the city.
Yeah, and they aren't just petty thieves.
Right, they are heavily armed militias. They extort the merchants, rob the citizens, burn down neighborhoods, and operate with absolute impunity because the official government has essentially evaporated.
Completely gone.
I am fascinated by the mechanics of this. The official state has abandoned the citizens. The military is hiding in their garrisons. Who steps up to fight off the syndicates?
The religious scholars.
But how? Scholars have books and ink. How do they fight heavily armed gangs?
They step up by mobilizing their massive public influence to create a parallel government.
Okay.
Scholars like Sahl ibn Salama and Ahmad ibn Nasr al-Khuza'i invoke the core Islamic ethical principle of commanding right and forbidding wrong. They use this theological mandate to justify creating localized neighborhood watches.
But they need funding. They need weapons.
Exactly. And because the scholars are deeply embedded in the community, the wealthy merchants who are being extorted by the gangs willingly fund the scholars.
Oh, wow.
The community donates weapons. Suddenly, these scholars aren't just preaching in the mosque. They are directing armed patrols.
They're organizing barricades.
Yes. They are actively fighting the Ayarun block by block, and they succeed where the state military failed. They restore order to Baghdad.
So let's put ourselves in the mind of the Caliph Al-Ma'mun.
Okay.
After 6 years of allowing his capital to burn, he finally decides it's safe to return. He organizes a grand procession, expecting to ride into Baghdad as the conquering absolute monarch.
Right.
But when he rides through the gates, he realizes the entire social fabric has shifted.
Everything has changed.
The religious scholars aren't just popular influencers anymore. They have built an administrative protective infrastructure. They are the de facto government of his capital.
It is an absolute nightmare for a centralized autocrat. The people of Baghdad don't look to the caliph for their survival. They look to the ulema.
Yeah.
Al-Ma'mun realizes that if he doesn't dismantle this parallel authority, he is just a figurehead.
He needs a mechanism to break the scholars.
Yes. To strip them of their moral invincibility and force them to bend the knee to the state.
And he finds that mechanism in the theological debate over the creation of the Quran. He initiates the Inquisition, the Mihna.
He issues a royal decree establishing the Mu'tazilite doctrine that the Quran is created as the official, unquestionable state dogma.
Right.
He announces that any individual holding a position of public trust, any judge, any scholar, any witness in a court of law who refuses to publicly affirm this doctrine will be purged from their position.
Stripped of their salary, imprisoned or executed.
Exactly.
It is a sweeping ideological purge.
Yeah.
But the genius, or I guess the sheer cynical brilliance of Al-Ma'mun's strategy is revealed in who he targets first.
Yeah, this is key.
Because he doesn't immediately arrest the scholars. He summons his military commanders.
This detail is the absolute proof of the state's true motives. He brings his generals and police chiefs, men who are professional killers, men with zero training in complex metaphysics, into the palace.
Right.
And he subjects them to the Inquisition. He demands to know their philosophical stance on whether the Word of God is created in time or eternally uncreated.
It's an absurd scenario. It's like a modern president demanding the Joint Chiefs of Staff debate advanced string theory.
Exactly.
And how do the generals respond?
They respond exactly how professional soldiers respond to a dictator. They shrug and say, whatever the caliph commands, we believe. If the caliph says it is created, then it is created.
They blindly submit. And if Al-Ma'mun were a genuine religious zealot who cared deeply about the purity of the faith, he would have been disgusted by that answer.
Right. He would have been furious that they didn't understand the theology.
But he wasn't disgusted.
No, he was thrilled.
Because the test functioned perfectly. It confirmed their absolute, unquestioning obedience.
And once he had the military locked down and proven loyal, he turned the full, terrifying machinery of the state against the scholars.
And for the scholars, this trap was devastating. They couldn't fight back militarily, so they had to make an agonizing choice. Many of them resorted to a concept called taqiyya.
Yeah.
Explain the psychology of that.
Taqiyya is the practice of dissimulation. Islamic law contains provisions that if a believer is facing imminent lethal violence, they are permitted to conceal their true beliefs.
Okay.
and they can verbally agree with their oppressors to save their own lives, provided their heart remains firm in the truth.
So these brilliant, deeply orthodox scholars are dragged before the caliph's tribunals. They are threatened with the sword.
Right.
And to avoid leaving their families destitute and themselves headless, they stand up in public and endorse a theology they believe is pure heresy.
The psychological and moral injury of that act is profound. You are a man who has dedicated his entire life to teaching the truth, and the state forces you to publicly lie. And for the state, that forced lie is a massive victory. When the masses see the revered imam cave to the caliph's pressure, the scholar's aura of divine protection is shattered.
And if a scholar hesitated or tried to offer a nuanced answer, the state didn't just debate them. The source material reveals that the Abbasids launched a highly coordinated, state-sponsored smear campaign.
Right.
They didn't attack the theology, they attacked the men.
The official court documents from the Inquisition are startling in their pettiness.
How so?
The state recognized that executing a popular scholar could spark a riot. But if you destroy his reputation first, no one will riot for him. So they instructed their officials to assassinate the characters of the dissidents.
The insults recorded in the sources are incredibly specific and clearly targeted at undermining public trust.
Yes, the state officially branded one dissenting scholar as a fool in his mind, attacking his basic intellectual competence.
Oh, wow.
They declared another scholar to be illegitimate in his lineage, attempting to shame him socially. They accused a highly respected judge of being a secret usurer, someone who engaged in illegal, exploitative financial practices.
Which is the fastest way to turn the working class against someone. He pretends to be holy, but he's stealing your money.
They even went after their social class. They mocked one scholar in the official records by calling him a seller of cheap dates.
Cheap dates.
The implication was, why are you listening to this low-class, deceitful street merchant about matters of high theology?
It is the exact playbook of modern authoritarianism, or even corporate warfare.
Exactly.
When a powerful entity wants to destroy a whistleblower or a political rival, they rarely engage with the substance of the critique. They leak financial rumors, they dig up personal scandals, they frame them as unstable or corrupt.
It's character assassination masquerading as an ideological dispute.
But not everyone could be bullied or smeared. The Inquisition occasionally ran into men who were too clever for the trap. The source highlights a phenomenal moment of defiance by a scholar named Yazid ibn Harun.
Oh, this might be the most brilliant political maneuver in the entire story.
Set the scene for us.
So Yazid ibn Harun lived in the city of Wasit, and he commanded a massive, deeply loyal following. Al-Ma'mun knows Yazid's influence, so he sends an official royal envoy to Wasit.
Okay.
The envoy confronts Yazid and says, "The Caliph commands you to publicly announce the new doctrine regarding the creation of the Quran to your followers."
Now Yazid is trapped. If he says no, the envoy reports him for treason. If he says yes, he loses his soul and his followers.
But Yazid knows his environment. He summons a massive gathering in Wasit.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of people show up.
Wow.
The state envoy is sitting right there, watching, waiting for Yazid to submit. Yazid stands up before the crowd, and instead of preaching the doctrine, he essentially calls the Caliph a liar.
But he does it with absolute plausible deniability.
He says to the crowd, "The Caliph, Al-Ma'mun, is a good and righteous man. He is from the noble family of the Prophet. A man of his deep intellect and piety would never believe such a heretical, disgusting thing as the Quran being created. Whoever is spreading this rumor about the Caliph is lying to you."
It is pure political jujitsu. He weaponizes the Caliph's own propaganda against the state.
Right.
By acting as if the doctrine is a malicious rumor against the Caliph, he forces the envoy into an impossible position.
Exactly. If the envoy stands up and arrests Yazid, the envoy is forced to publicly admit to tens of thousands of angry people that the Caliph does in fact believe the heresy.
Which would start a riot.
He realizes he would probably be torn apart by the mob. He has no choice but to quietly slink away and report back to Al-Ma'mun that Yazid outsmarted them.
But Yazid was an exception. As the years went on and the caliphs changed from Al-Ma'mun to Al-Mu'tasim and then Al-Wathiq, the Inquisition hardened.
Yeah, it got much worse.
It became more desperate and far more violent. Which brings us to the individuals the source identifies as the true martyrs of the Mihna.
Because when most people who have studied Islamic history hear about the Inquisition, they think of one name, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
Right.
He is universally remembered as the hero who resisted the ordeal. But the source material makes a provocative, critical argument.
What's that?
It demands that we look at the men who suffered much, much worse fates than Ibn Hanbal, because examining their deaths reveals exactly what the state was truly terrified of.
Let's look at the first figure, the source details. Nu'aym ibn Hamad. He is brought to the capital in chains all the way from Egypt. Why was he targeted so aggressively?
Because Nu'aym ibn Muhammad was not just a quiet theologian sitting in a mosque. He was an active, highly effective propagandist.
Okay.
He had compiled and written a widely circulated book titled Al-Fitan, which translates to The Tribulations or The Trials.
What kind of material was in this book that made him so dangerous?
It was apocalyptic political literature. During times of immense social stress, apocalyptic prophecies surge in popularity. Nu'aym's book was filled with narratives and alleged prophecies that systematically delegitimized the entire Abbasid dynasty. He wrote that the famous black flags of the Abbasid armies were actually signs of death and demonic destruction. He claimed their rule was doomed and catastrophic for the Muslim community.
He is basically publishing the medieval equivalent of an underground radical manifesto, using apocalyptic religious language to tell the masses that the government is illegitimate and its days are numbered.
Exactly. So the Abbasid secret police arrest him. They drag him from Egypt. And they don't just put him in a normal cell.
What do?
They shackle him with a massive 60-pound iron weight. He is thrown into a dungeon and left there to slowly die.
60 pounds. And his final request before he died in that cell is incredibly haunting.
It is. He asked his fellow prisoners to ensure he was buried in his chains.
Wow.
He explicitly stated that he wanted to be resurrected on the day of judgment, still wearing those heavy iron shackles, so he could drag them before God and argue his case directly against the caliph who imprisoned him.
Buried in 60 pounds of iron. But the critical insight here is the discrepancy in the paperwork. The official state records claimed he was imprisoned because he refused to agree that the Quran was created.
But the reality is glaringly obvious. The state didn't chain him to a wall because of his metaphysical views on the burning bush.
Right.
They tortured him to death because he wrote highly effective, viral anti-state propaganda. The Theological Inquisition simply provided the legal framework to lock up a dangerous political dissident without admitting they were afraid of his book.
Which brings us back to the man we mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive. The severed head on the bridge. Ahmad ibn Nasr al-Khuza'i.
Yes.
His story absolutely blew my mind because the state's logic seems completely backward until you understand the narrative control. Who was Ahmad ibn Nasr?
Ahmad ibn Nasr was the ultimate insider. His grandfather was literally one of the foundational military commanders who helped the Abbasids overthrow the Umayyads.
So he's elite.
He was deep inherited establishment. But living in Baghdad, he witnessed the 6 years of anarchy. He organized the neighborhood watches.
Right.
He saw the corruption of the military commanders and the brutality of the Inquisition, and he decided the Abbasid Caliph, who was al-Wathiq at this time, had to be removed.
And he didn't just write a book about it. He took action.
He orchestrated a massive, highly coordinated military coup. He used his connections to secure funding from wealthy merchants. He secretly distributed money to loyalist factions.
Wow.
He had rebel flags manufactured and hidden in homes across the city. He had a shadow army ready to storm the palace and assassinate the caliph.
But the Abbasid intelligence network, the companions of the news, catches wind of it.
Yes. Just 2 days before the coup is scheduled to launch, the secret police raid his compound. They find the weapons, they find the rebel flags, they capture the money.
They got him.
They arrest Ahmad ibn Nasr red-handed and drag him in chains before the Caliph Al-Wathiq.
Okay, let's pause here. Put yourself in the room. You are the absolute emperor. The secret police have just dragged a man before your throne who is 48 hours away from cutting your throat.
Yeah.
He has a funded network of conspirators still out there in your city. The obvious logical interrogation protocol is immediate and aggressive. Who gave you the money? Which generals are working with you? Where are the rest of the weapons?
But that is not what Caliph Al-Wathiq does.
No.
The Caliph looks at the man who just tried to orchestrate a massive political revolution against him, ignores the treason entirely, and asks him, "What do you say regarding the creation of the Quran?"
Why? Why would the Caliph ignore a literal funded military coup to ask a philosophy question?
Because the Caliph understands that narrative control is more important than intelligence gathering in that specific moment. Think about the optics. If al-Wathiq executes Ahmad ibn Nasr for treason, he is publicly acknowledging a terrifying truth. That there are legitimate elite members of his own society who view his government as so irredeemably corrupt that they're willing to fund a war against it.
Right.
Executing him for treason validates the grievance. It makes Ahmad a political martyr.
Oh, the Caliph is reframing the reality.
Exactly. By pivoting the interrogation entirely to the theology of the Inquisition, the Caliph achieves two massive propaganda victories. First, he totally discredits the rebellion.
He makes him look crazy.
He signals to the public that this wasn't a righteous uprising against corruption. It was a sinister plot by a dangerous, irrational religious heretic.
It strips the nobility out of the coup.
And second, it elevates the Caliph. By focusing on the theology, al-Wathiq frames himself not as a paranoid, vulnerable dictator fighting off assassins, but as the holy, divine defender of the true faith, protecting Islam from corruption.
That is deeply, cynically brilliant. He uses the Inquisition to execute his political rivals while claiming the moral high ground. And the execution itself was deliberately theatrical.
When Ahmad ibn Nasr predictably refused to yield to the state doctrine, the Caliph didn't just wave a hand and let a guard do the work.
What did he do?
Al-Wathiq personally stood up, drew a legendary ancient sword known in Arab lore as Samsama, a blade with deep historical significance, and he decapitated Ahmad ibn Nasr with his own hands.
The emperor acts as the executioner to prove his divine mandate. And then they hang the head on the bridge for 6 years, heavily guarded, as a permanent, gruesome billboard warning anyone who might consider finishing the coup.
But even then, the people recognized the truth. That's why they snuck out at night to recite the Quran to his head. They knew he died fighting a corrupt state, not fighting over a philosophical nuance.
Which brings us to the final, lingering question. The enigma of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
Yes.
We just detailed a propagandist who was buried in 60 pounds of iron and an elite aristocrat who was decapitated by the emperor himself. But Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the man history remembers as the ultimate victim and victor of the Mihna, survived.
He did.
He suffered, but comparatively, the state treated him with restraint.
Why? Well, the physical reality of Ibn Hanbal's ordeal was severe, but heavily calibrated. He was imprisoned for a time, and the records indicate he was whipped roughly 30 to 37 lashes.
Okay.
Afterward, he spent years under house arrest. But he was never executed, and he was never permanently maimed like other dissidents.
So why the restraint?
The reason he survived is tied to a massive tectonic shift in Sunni political thought that he himself championed.
A shift away from the violent rebellions of the past.
Exactly. Remember the heritage we discussed earlier? The 500 scholars executed by the Umayyads? The constant bloody civil wars?
Right.
After generations of watching the Islamic world tear itself apart in failed uprisings, a critical mass of scholars, spearheaded by figures like Ahmad ibn Hanbal, came to a highly pragmatic, deeply conservative conclusion.
Which was?
They decided that armed rebellion against the state, even a tyrannical, unjust state, inevitably causes more destruction, more bloodshed, and more societal collapse than simply enduring the tyranny.
So Ibn Hanbal's core political philosophy was, the Caliph is wrong, the Inquisition is unjust, the state is corrupt, but we will endure it patiently, and we will absolutely not pick up swords against the emperor.
That was his red line.
Mm-hmm.
He explicitly preached against overthrowing the state. He commanded his massive following to remain peaceful.
And the Abbasid intelligence network was highly competent. They knew exactly what he was preaching.
They knew Ibn Hanbal despised their theology, but they also knew he was fundamentally, doctrinally opposed to a military coup.
So the state wasn't just blindly lashing out. They calibrated their violence based on the actual physical threat level.
Right.
They decapitate the guy who buys swords and flags. They whip the guy who just disagrees with them but tells his followers to stay home.
They whipped Ibn Hanbal in public to try and break his aura of invincibility. They wanted to humiliate him in front of his followers.
But they stopped short of killing him.
Because executing a man who was actively pacifying the masses would be a catastrophic, unforced error. They didn't want to create an unnecessary martyr out of a man who was suppressing the rebellion for them.
It was a highly calculated risk management strategy. And it worked, for a time. But eventually, the political winds shifted entirely. Years later, a new caliph, Al-Mutawakkil, ascends to the throne.
Yes.
He surveys the empire and realizes the Inquisition has become a massive liability. It has completely alienated the populace, so he makes a calculated pivot.
Al-Mutawakkil officially ends the Mihna. He reverses the state doctrine, outlaws the Mu'tazilite position, and declares the traditional Sunni belief victorious.
So he just flips.
He essentially tries to play the hero, scoring massive political points by allying himself with the powerful religious establishment that his predecessors had tortured.
I am the savior of the true faith. But even as he embraces the Sunni cause, the source material shows that al-Mutawakkil is still absolutely terrified of Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
Because the underlying power dynamic hadn't changed. Even without the Inquisition, Ibn Hanbal still possessed the crowd power.
Right.
He was still the man who could summon hundreds of thousands of people to the streets. The state had surrendered on the theology, but they still needed to control the man.
So what does he do?
So al-Mutawakkil tries a different tactic. He tries to smother him with patronage.
He forces Ibn Hanbal into a golden cage.
He compels Ibn Hanbal to leave his power base in Baghdad and places him under what we would call luxury house arrest in the new administrative capital of Samarra.
Oh, wow.
The Caliph sends him vast sums of money, fine clothes, and lavish food. The goal was to make it look like the great defiant scholar had finally become a comfortable, well-fed pet of the Abbasid state.
And how does a man who survived the whips of the Inquisition respond to luxury?
He responds with a devastating hunger strike.
Really?
Ibn Hanbal refuses to eat the state's food. He refuses to wear their clothes. He starves himself, rejecting their wealth, refusing to let them co-opt his moral authority.
That's incredible.
He pushes himself to the brink of death until the Caliph, terrified of the backlash if the scholar dies in his custody, finally relents and allows him to return to his simple life in Baghdad.
But even then, he isn't truly free.
No. Even back in his modest home, the Abbasid secret police, the companions of the news, maintained heavy, constant surveillance on his house. They tracked who visited him, what he said, and where he went, up until the day he died.
If we synthesize all of this, the ironies are just incredible. The state tortured Ahmad ibn Hanbal because they feared his massive public influence. But because he survived, because he resolutely refused to endorse armed rebellion, his specific stance of patient resistance became the dominant theological and political view of Sunni Islam to this very day.
It's amazing.
The Abbasids tried to break him, and instead they inadvertently immortalized his exact philosophy.
That is the ultimate takeaway. And it emphatically reinforces the main thesis of the historical analysis we've been unpacking.
Yeah.
We must always read between the lines of history. We cannot accept the official court documents at face value.
Exactly.
The Mihna, this grand, empire-wide inquisition, was never truly a debate about the metaphysical nature of a holy book. That was simply the smokescreen.
It was a vicious, desperate struggle for survival.
A struggle between a centralized state machinery that desperately lacked organic, popular legitimacy and the grassroots religious scholars who firmly held the hearts, minds, and absolute loyalties of the masses.
Yeah.
The theological doctrine was the chosen battlefield, but raw, unquestioned power was always the prize.
We have covered a staggering amount of ground today. We started with an abstract philosophical debate about how God spoke to Moses from a burning bush.
We really did.
And we followed that single thread to reveal a hidden world of underground shadow networks, Sasanian commanders riding in winged chairs, 6 years of violent urban anarchy, character assassination, and severed heads guarded by watchtowers.
It serves as a profound, perhaps unsettling reminder that while the costumes and the vocabulary of civilization change, human nature and the mechanics of authoritarian control remain remarkably consistent across the centuries.
And that leads me to something I want you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive.
Yes.
The next time you are watching the news and you see a massive, highly technical or intensely ideological debate taking over the public discourse, whether it is a bitter partisan fight in national politics, a sudden vicious culture war tearing through academia, or a newly instituted ethical purity test in corporate boardrooms, take a step back.
Look past the stated arguments.
Exactly. Ask yourself, is this genuinely about the philosophy? Is this really about the moral issue they are screaming about? Or is this just a loyalty test? Is this a manufactured crisis deliberately designed to force people to pick a side, to see exactly who will submit to authority and who needs to be purged from the ranks?
And if we carry that analytical framework forward, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder on your own. We have just examined how the Abbasid Empire ingeniously utilized complex theology to mask their brutal political purges 1,000 years ago. Look at the landscape of our world today. What are the unquestionable doctrines of our own time that serve that exact same purpose? Who are the modern scholars, the unauthorized voices who possess the raw crowd power to genuinely terrify the state or the established institutions? And what new, sophisticated loyalty tests are being quietly designed right now to trap them?